To prepare the pieces for the router, roughly cut the rails, base, and bed plate out on the bandsaw. You want to leave about 1/8 of an inch around all the pieces. This is so we have less material to remove on the router. If you find that you didn't remove enough material with the bandsaw, you can use a belt sander with 80 grit sandpaper to quickly remove more material, but be careful not to oversand. To cut the 3/4 inch plywood pieces, we're going to use a 1/2 inch flush trim bit, and to cut the bed plate, we're going to use a 3/8 inch flush trim bit. Make sure the bearing is adjusted to the same level as the template. Now begin cutting the lower rail. To keep the wood from burning, I recommend doing several passes to remove the material. This will also leave you with a more accurate cut. Use the same process to shape the upper and bottom rails. Notice that I'm using a single router to make these cuts. You can use the same approach, but please be careful. If you have a router table, I would strongly advise using that instead. To cut the bed plate out, we are going to use a 3/8 inch flush trim bit. Notice that the bearing sits above the router bit, so you will need to adjust the height of the router to where the bearing sits flush against the template. After trimming all the pieces out, remove the screws from the templates in stock. Do this for the rails, base, and bed plate. Lightly sand with 240 grit sandpaper the inside edge for both the lower and upper rail. This is so the router has a smooth surface to write on. Starting with the upper rail, we need to make a measurement on the inside edge. This is to set the router's depth for cutting the channel. Using your calipers, measure from the bottom edge and make a mark at 0.24 inches. Use the same approach on the lower rail and measure 0.39 inches and make a mark on the inside edge of the rail. To cut the 3/16 inch channel for our rails, we need to remove a 3/8 inch bearing from the 7/8 inch rabbet cutting bit and replace it with a 1/2 inch bearing. If you have a set of router bits, you can generally find a 1/2 inch bearing to use for this process. Set the router's depth to 0.39 inches and cut the channel on the inside edge of the lower rail. Set the router depth to 0.24 inches and cut the channel on the inside edge of the upper rail. Use some 240 grit sandpaper and lightly sand the inside edge of both the lower and upper rail. This is to remove any rough edges left behind from the router. Use some candle wax and rub it into the inside edge of both the lower and upper rail. Then wipe away the excess wax. This will make the ammunition track better in the magazine loader. Pre-drill with a 3/32 drill bit all of the marked holes where we removed the screws from. Do this for the lower, upper, and bottom rail. Using a 1/2 inch countersink bit, countersink all of the pre-drilled holes. Do this for the lower, upper, and bottom rails. Position the base, bed plate, and lower rail into place. To check that the pieces are sitting flush to one another, run your fingers along the edges. Once you have them in the correct position, tighten them down with clamps. Pre-drill all the holes with a 3/32 drill bit. Fasten the lower rail in place with 4 number 8 inch and a quarter wood screws. Work from corner to corner as you fasten the lower rail in place. To make it a little easier to line the top rail to the bed plate and base, position the wood clamps in place and tighten a small amount. Then align the rail and tighten the clamps down all the way. Pre-drill all 4 holes with a 3/32 drill bit and secure the top rail in place with 4 number 8 inch and a quarter wood screws. Align the bottom rail in place, then clamp down in the middle between the 2 holes. Pre-drill both holes and fasten the rail in place with 2 number 8 inch and a quarter screws. Then remove the clamp, pre-drill, and fasten the last inch and a quarter screw.